guys, I'm Cass. I'm a resin artist and a woodworker, and today I'm going to be giving you a little tutorial on how I create these resin shell casing pieces with moss epoxies and my crafted element molds. So again, I'm going to be showing you guys a step-by-step process on how you can make one all by yourself from beginning all the way to finishing, and how I wet sand and how I get a nice sleek look. So let's head out and start this piece out in the studio. Okay guys, so I am out in the studio and today I will be using the 12 by 12 and the 25 by 5 crafted element molds. And you can see that I don't even have to lay any plastic down here. I probably should have because I do get resin on the board, but I'd already had resin on it anyways. My main point is I don't have to worry about any leaks with these crafted element molds. So my first step is using this paste finishing wax. This is just helping the lifetime of my mold by protecting it from any resin sticking on there. There are some mold sprays that you can use and whatnot, but today I'm just using what I have, and I'm just going to use a paper towel to wipe all this down. So this is in fast forward obviously, but I am just making sure to wipe all of the bottoms and the sides. I'm not really worried about that wax getting stuck to the bottom because when the piece is finished, I'm going to sand the bottom anyways. So no issues there for this project. And then I'm just going to go ahead and place my pre-cut pieces of wood into the molds. You can see for that top piece, it's in two different pieces. That's because the top piece is actually going to be used for 3 different pieces. So here I am just talking with my hands, demonstrating that both pieces are on this big piece of MDF. So as long as I get that piece of MDF leveled out, that both pieces should be level in the molds. My first layer of epoxy is going to be with Moss Epoxy's flag system. This is a 2-to-1 system, and I'm going to be pairing it with the medium hardener. So the flag mixed with the medium is going to give me about a 4-hour cure time. So compared to tabletop, which has an 8-hour cure time, this is just going to allow me to get to the step of the deep pour a little bit sooner. And I'm using this layer as a base. That way the shell casings aren't setting right flush with the mold, because once this is out of the mold, I'm going to sand the bottom and I don't want to expose any of those shell casings. And again, this is a 2-to-1 system, so I have my part A poured and my part B poured. You can see I did 2 of A and 1 of B, so 4 ounces of A and 2 ounces of B. So the next step is stirring, and this is a super important step. You have to make sure that you're stirring everything thoroughly. If you don't get everything stirred thoroughly, your resin is not going to cure properly. So you want to stir until you don't see that cloudy look or those string-like striations. You want to continue to scrape the sides to mix both part A and B. And then before I go ahead and pour, I'm just going to use these heavy bottles of resin to kind of push down those pieces of wood, get a good seal between the wood and the mold. That way we don't have a lot of resin seeping underneath where we don't want it. So I have this poured in, and I'm going to make sure that it's all evenly spread, and I'm also going to coat the wood a little bit where the deep pour is going to adhere to. And then my next step is to just use a torch to pop any bubbles and make sure there's no debris in the resin. And then I'm going to come back 4 hours later for the deep pour. Alright, so I am back 4 hours later and I am ready for my deep pour. So very important that you pay close attention to the ratio. The regular deep pour is a 3-to-1 ratio. So my big mixing cup didn't have the correct measurements on it, so I decided to make my own 3-to-1 marks using water. So what I did was I filled this smaller mixing cup up with 10 ounces, dumped it in, filled it up with 10, dumped it in, one last time, dumped it in. That gave me my 3 mark. Next, I did one more scoop of 10 ounces and dumped it in to get my 1 mark. So that is 30 ounces of part A to 10 ounces of part B. So my next step is to add the shell casing. So I clean all of my shell casings at home in a tumbler. So what the tumbler does is kind of vibrates the shell casings in those little stones. But then once they're clean, I take them out and I'm always left with that media stuck inside the shell casings. So I'm just making sure that I have all of those out, and then I'm not worried about placement here, but I'm just gonna start putting a bunch of shell casings in there until I get a feel for how many pieces I want in that mold. Again, I'm not worried about placement here because once I pour my resin in, it's going to move the shell casings all over anyways. So again, I am using the regular deep pour at a 3-to-1 ratio. So I'm going to do 30 ounces of my part A and then 10 ounces of my part B. And the next step is mixing. And again, just like the flag system, it's super important to mix your resin thoroughly. I'm using a piece that goes on your drill, but obviously I'm not using my drill. So I'm just going to mix this for about 2 minutes to get all of those string-like striations out. And then as you can see, my resin is nice and clear and ready to pour in. Okay, and now it's time to pour in the resin. And seriously, you guys, these crafted element molds take all the stress away. I was always so stressed to pour my deep pour in because I was just waiting for a leak. And something that I get asked so often is how do I not end up with bubbles when I'm working with shell casings? To be honest, I just really haven't had an issue with it. You can see that the bubbles are kind of popping out of the shell casings, and if I get my stir stick underneath the bubble, it kind of pops them out there. But the deep pour is so thin and it takes a good amount of time to cure. So it really, all the bubbles just kind of seem to rise. So I'm really not left with any bubbles. If you are using a thicker resin, that could definitely be your problem. Again, I definitely suggest using the deep pour. It's nice and thin, and again, I don't have any issues with bubbles. So here I'm just placing all my shell casings where I want them to go. And then something that I have learned the hard way is you don't want any shell casings up against the edge of your piece in case you need to cut it or sand it. You don't want to cut through or have any shell casings exposed. So you just want to clear that away from the edge to make sure you have room to cut. And now I'm going to go ahead and pour my second piece, and I'm going to speed this up because it's going to be the same exact process. And you can see I poured a little bit too much, so I'm just going to use a mixing cup to scoop some of that out. And then I'm just going to go ahead and place the shell casings where I want them to go. But remember that this mold is going to actually be making 3 different pieces. So I want to leave a space to cut that down the center, as well as clearing the shell casings from the edge of the mold. So now I'm going to go back with the torch and pop any bubbles. So those bubbles that you're seeing are actually on the bottom of the piece from the flag system. So those won't really matter because once we take the piece out of the mold, we'll put it into the planer and sand the back. So all of those bubbles will go away. Okay, so now the piece is cured and ready to take out of the mold. Now you will see in the center of that 12 by 12 piece that there was a bubble that I had to go back and fill with tabletop, and I was left with a bunch of bubbles hugging up against the mold, which is again why I make sure no shell casings are placed on the edges. That way I can just go back with a table saw and cut all those bubbles off. So I have this slowed down to real time just to show you guys how easy it is to pop these pieces out of your mold. I still try to make sure I go nice and slow just in case it gets stuck on there, but otherwise super easy to pop out. Super clean back. You can see on the left side there, I probably could have went heavier with the weights. I had more leakage on that side than the other. And I don't know why I ended up with those bubbles, but we'll plane all those out. And yeah, you guys can see how clean this mold is left. You won't have to do any cleanup in between projects. But let's move this piece aside and demold this next one. And you can see I'm just kind of pushing the edges out little by little before I try to pop that out. Again, these pop out really easy, but you still want to be careful with them so you don't damage them because they're expensive, and trust me, you don't want to go back to creating your own mold. But you can see super simple pop out, and this back was really clean. It'll be so easy to just sand that back off. And then the next step is to go out to the wood shop and hit the table saw and the planer and get them ready to be wet sanded. All right, so I'm out in the wood shop and I am just using the table saw to clean up my edges. I don't really have to square my pieces a ton with these molds because they're pretty sturdy, but again, I had all those bubbles along the edges, so I just want to go back and clean all those edges up. And again, same with this piece. And remember, this piece is going to be 3 separate pieces, so I'm going to next take it over to the miter saw and cut those down the middle. So again, this piece is going to be turned into 3 separate pieces, and I did leave a gap in order to cut that spot right there, but I didn't include it in the video, but I did have to cut through a shell casing on the left piece because I forgot to leave a gap. I probably didn't include it because I was mad that I forgot, but yeah, so I'm cutting through this piece, and then I did not show, but I am actually cutting that left piece in half again also. All right, so now it's time to plane all of these pieces flat. I start with the bottoms and then I work on the tops. It seems like I do about 100 passes, but it's so much quicker than using a sander, obviously. So I'm just running all of these pieces through, and then I'll show you guys what they look like when I'm done planing, and then the next step will be to sand. And this is usually where I stop. So you're going to be able to tell that my planer obviously needs some attention. It left some pretty nasty marks, but this is usually where I stop. Some is planed, some is not. And that also means that that isn't level right there. The wood is higher than the resin, but instead of going another pass and accidentally exposing those shell casings, I'm just going to go back by hand with the orbital sander to smooth all that out. Again, I was left with some pretty nasty planer marks, but we're going to get that all smoothed out with the sander. So let's go and do that. All right, guys, so now it's time to sand. So I have my Marca sander, which I'm absolutely in love with, and I'm starting with a 40 grit of their sandpaper. So I'm just going to first work on smoothing down those planer marks and smoothing down the piece in general. And then once I have everything fairly even and smooth, then I will start to increase my grits. So everything is fairly smooth here, so I'll flip it over and just clean up the back quick, and then we're going to move on to 80 grit. So again, switching to 80 grit. When you're moving up in grits, you want to make sure you don't skip too many levels. For instance, I'm going to go from 40 to 80 to 120. You guys will see, but you just want to make sure you don't go straight from 40 to 240 or something. You want to keep those grits moving up nice and slow. That's just going to help you avoid any swirl marks. So again, you got to go slowly. If you go from, say, 40 grit to 240 grit, you're going to really notice those swirl marks. So again, little by little with wet sanding and moving up with grits just to avoid those swirl marks. So right there I have a little hole in the wood, and I'm just going to use some Star Bond. This is a 2-part system. I'm just putting the Star Bond glue in there, and then I'll use the accelerating spray. This is gonna cure in like 30 seconds or something, and then I'll be able to sand that smooth, and it'll just leave you with a tiny little black hole that kind of goes with the wood anyway. So I prefer this whenever I'm filling any tiny little voids. And this is just water in my squirt bottle. I'm just cleaning the surface with water and a paper towel before I move on to the next grit. But first, I'm just going to smooth that area out where I use the Star Bond, and you're going to see it's just going to leave me with a tiny little black hole. And this is in real time right here, so you guys can see how slowly my hand is moving. You really want to let the sander do its job. Don't feel like you have to go back and forth to get the sander to work. Let the sander sand. I feel like that's a pretty common thing when people are sanding. You feel like you really gotta move the sander around, and that's really not the case. It's an orbital sander for a reason. It's spinning around, and I just knocked the camera, but it's spinning around and it's gonna do its job. Again, go really slow. It kind of lengthens the process, but it makes it a lot more worth it, and it gives you a lot better results. All right, so I'm gonna clean this surface off and I'm gonna move on to the next grits, and I'm gonna speed this process up a little bit more so you guys aren't just watching me sand for the next 15 more minutes. All right, so next up is 120 and 240. So again, first with 120, I am cleaning my surface, sanding everything smooth, cleaning my surface, and now I'm ready for 240 grit. Once again, guys, this is super sped up, so I'm going really slow, making sure to get all the surface area sanded evenly. I don't really focus on the wood. I actually try not to sand the wood, mainly just focusing on the resin, but it's pretty impossible not to get the wood sanded also. But again, I'm just cleaning my surface area a lot here in between, and I'm gonna then start to wet sand with soapy water. And this is literally just some dish soap and water, a little trick I learned from Woodworks by Jared. But wet sanding in general is to add lubrication to the sanding process, so adding that soapy water is just a little extra. So the next grit up is 360, and once again, I'm using my soapy water. I will throw the name brand of this sandpaper as well as where you guys can purchase this at. I'll put that up on the screen. But again, don't forget to sand your sides also, and I keep adding water a couple times before I move on to the next grit. Also want to make sure you clean it off in between grits, and you guys can already see how clear it's getting after every grit. I think that's my favorite part, is wiping it clean after every grit and slowly seeing it getting clearer and clearer. Now, after 500 grit, there are 600 and 800, but I could not find them anywhere. So my next grit that I'm going to move on to is 1000. And obviously we know that when we add the water that it really makes those shell casings shine, but you can see that even once this water dries, before I add more water, look how much better you can see the shell casings right now compared to the beginning when we were only standing at 40 or 80 or even 120 grit. Okay, but now up to 2000, I'm doing the same thing. And again, I'm not smothering this with water. It's not a lot. I'm just getting some on my hands and then wiping it on the board. Once it gets dried up, I'll add a little bit more, but I'm not like soaking the piece. You don't need a ton of water. Okay, and now it's time for 3000. Once again, we are repeating the process all over again, watching this piece get clearer and clearer as we go. Again, this is one of the most satisfying things that I think that I do with all of my pieces combined. I think this is by far the most satisfying thing to do. It can also be the most frustrating thing, so if you guys don't get the perfect finish right off the bat, don't get discouraged. But up next, we're going to start with 4000, and this is the first time, you guys are witnessing the first time that I am using this Polar Shine. The Polar Shine is a polishing compound that is usually used with a buffer, but I decided to experiment with the 4000. So what I'm gonna do is just put a little bit of the compound on my board and spread it around before I start sanding. So again, the polishing compound is usually used with a buffer and a buffing pad, but I'm experimenting with this 4000 grit, and honestly, the results just speak for themselves. It turned out really super shiny and clear. These are the best results I've ever gotten, and this honestly was like my holy crap moment. Like, holy crap, how have I been living without this Polo Shine for this long? So yeah, highly recommend including and incorporating that into your wet sanding and polishing process. Now, I typically do everything to the back as I do to the front, so I finish it and polish it to a high grit on the back, but I wanted to show you guys the kind of like frosted effect that it has if you only sand up to like 120 or 240 on the back. To finish the wood, I'm using Odie's oil. Now, a lot of people ask me, do I apply the Odie's oil after I've already went up to 4000? And the answer is no. So I usually go back down and sand the wood, only the wood. I'm very careful not to scuff up the freshly polished resin. I sand just the wood portion at either 120 or 240 grit, and that just helps the Odie's oil adhere to the wood. And then for the back, I decided to just oil it, and look how clear that is. Okay guys, so these pieces turned out awesome. All the way from the beginning, the crafted element molds made my life so much easier. You're really gonna wanna add that to your shop. It makes the process so much smoother and quicker. I didn't have to worry about any leaks. And then again, with a 25-inch mold, I'm able to create 3 different pieces. I don't know if you saw when I was planing the pieces, the last one did break, so I have to go back and finish that later. But yeah, it made my life so much easier. I didn't have to make 3 molds. I got 3 pieces out of 1 mold. But yeah, I'm really pleased with these pieces, and I hope that you guys are too. Alright guys, so thank you so much for watching. I hope that you learned something, and most importantly, I'm so excited to see what you create after watching this tutorial. And also, if you guys enjoyed this tutorial, please like and follow my channel. I'm really trying to build up my YouTube account, but also please tag me on Instagram. My handle is @StoneMillnCo, and I will put that below. I'm so excited again to see what you guys create.